Welcome to the Chapter 7 lecture on production and growth. Differences in income reflect differences in quality of life. You know this. When you have more cash in your wallet, you can go out to eat, buy things, and have a good time. When you're broke, you can't go out, and purchasing the necessities becomes difficult. Standards of living are different between countries and also change within countries over time. Standard of living is the availability of the basics, food, clothing, and shelter, to the average person. If you've ever traveled outside the United States, you know that people living in South America or Asia have a different standard of living than we do in the United States. Standard of living has also changed greatly in our own country. Think about what it was like to live back during the Industrial Revolution compared to today. U.S. average income, measured by real GDP per person, has grown by 2% per year. 2% per year may not sound like a lot, but that rate of growth implies that incomes double every 35 years. That's roughly every generation. If we continue on this growth path, you should be twice as wealthy as your parents when you get to your parents' age. The Asian tigers, which consist of Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, have seen their average incomes increase by 7% per year. This rate of growth implies that incomes double every 10 years. This is a huge growth rate. Imagine your income doubling every 10 years. The African countries like Chad and Nigeria have stagnated, and average incomes have not changed at all over the last few decades. In Chapter 7, we're going to explore what causes these differences. Economists want to know, how do rich countries like the United States continue to grow? What can poor countries like Chad and Nigeria do to promote growth? And what policies should be in place to help promote growth overall? Two key terms before we get into the material for this chapter. Real GDP is a good measure to gauge economic welfare, and growth in real GDP is our good gauge of economic progress. The answer to what explains the differences in living standards is actually quite simple. This chapter focuses on the role of productivity and what determines productivity. Variations in living standards can be summed up in one word: productivity. If we say that people in the United States have a greater standard of living compared to those who live in India, what we are really saying is the United States is more productive than India. Productivity is defined as the quantity of goods and services produced from each unit of labor input. Think of the example from the movie Castaway. Tom's standard of living is directly tied to his level of productivity. The more productive he is, the more fish he can catch, the more vines he can braid into rope, the bigger fire he can build. His standard of living will be relatively high. If Tom is not very productive and he can't catch very many fish, or make rope or build a fire, then his living standard will be relatively low. There are four main factors that determine productivity. The first is the amount of physical capital per worker. Workers are more productive when they have tools to work with. Imagine if Tom had a fishing pole or a knife. He would be much more productive in catching fish and cutting vines with those tools. Next is human capital per worker. Human capital is defined as the knowledge and skills workers acquire through education, training, and experience. An example of human capital would be if Tom took a survival training course. He would already have the education and training to survive in the wild. He might already know how to build a fire without a match or how to catch fish, therefore increasing his. The third determinant of productivity is natural resources per worker. Natural resources are inputs into production provided by nature. Examples include physical land, rivers, and mineral deposits, to name a few. An example would be the number of fish in the lagoon or the number of banana trees on the island. If there are only a few fish in the entire lagoon, then the probability of tom catching one is relatively low. If there are hundreds of fish in the lagoon, then the probability of tom catching one fish is relatively high. Same goes for the number of banana trees. The more natural resources, the greater the probability of being productive. The last determinant of productivity is technological knowledge. Technological knowledge is the understanding of the best way to produce goods and services. There are many ways to get things done, but knowing the best way will increase productivity. Think about spearing fish or making rope. There's lots of ways to do these activities, but understanding the best way to spear fish will yield the most fish caught. Understanding the best way to make rope will result in more rope. Well-designed public policy can enhance economic growth. The last half of the chapter describes the ways the government can raise productivity and living standards. The first type of public policy is savings and investment. Remember, investment to an economist means the purchase of capital. By investing current resources into the production of capital, the economy will increase its physical capital per worker, therefore increasing productivity. However, there is a trade-off. To invest more in capital, a society must consume less and save more current income. The economy will sacrifice consumption today in order to enjoy greater consumption in the future. If an economy cannot handle the trade-off between consuming less and saving more, they can have investment from abroad rather than domestic savings and investment. There are two kinds of foreign investment. First is called foreign direct investment, which is a capital investment owned and operated by a foreign entity. An example of this would be an American company opening and operating the day-to-day activities of a production plant in a foreign country. The other type of foreign investment is called foreign portfolio investment, which is an investment that's financed with foreign money but operated by domestic residents. An example of this would be an American investing in a company in Taiwan whose day-to-day activities are operated by Taiwanese residents. Investment from abroad is a great way for poor countries to learn state-of-the-art technologies developed and used in rich countries. Rather than developing the technology themselves, they are able to duplicate existing production technology to work in their own markets. The third way the government can help increase productivity is by promoting education, which increases human capital. In the United States, each year of schooling, on average, increases wages by 10%. There is a positive correlation between education, human capital, higher levels of productivity, and wages. Brain drain is a problem facing poor countries, which occurs when highly educated workers immigrate to rich countries. This leaves the poor country with a lower level of human capital. The fourth way the government can improve productivity is by promoting health and nutrition. Healthier workers are more productive than unhealthy workers. The causal link between health and wealth runs in both directions, meaning that healthier workers are wealthier because they produce more output, and wealthier workers are healthier because they can afford health care. The government can increase productivity by enforcing property rights and remaining politically stable. A stable government, one without corruption, establishes and enforces property rights, which encourages investment by owners, which increases productivity trade is another public policy that can increase productivity. A closed economy is one that does not trade with others. Therefore, the society can only consume what it produces. An open economy is an economy that freely trades with other economies without government restrictions in the form of tariffs or quotas. When economies trade, each economy can focus on producing goods and services for which they have the comparative advantage in, and enjoy a greater variety of goods and services. Lastly, the government can promote research and development to increase productivity. The government can sponsor research of new technologies like it does with NASA, offer tax breaks to private firms conducting research and development like it does with many pharmaceutical companies, or issue patents as incentive for individuals to engage in research and development. There is a problem with the first public policy, savings and investment. Investing current resources into the production of capital has different effects on rich versus poor countries. Production is subject to diminishing returns. As the amount of capital increases, the extra output produced from each additional unit of capital falls. There is a diagram of diminishing returns on page 145 of the textbook. Diminishing returns is the idea that as you have more and more tools to work with, each individual tool produces less additional output. Since production is subject to diminishing returns, increases in savings only lead to higher growth temporarily. This implies that it's easier for a country to grow fast if it starts off relatively poor. This phenomenon is called the catch-up effect, meaning that poor countries tend to grow at a faster rate than rich countries. Here's an example. Between 1960 and 1990, the U.S. and South Korea devoted a similar share of GDP to investment. The U.S. was already relatively rich, therefore we grew at a slow pace, about 2% per year. South Korea was relatively poor, therefore they grew at a much faster pace, about 6% per year. This is the end of the Chapter 7 lecture on production and growth. If you have any questions about the concepts covered in this chapter, please email me or post a question in the Ask Professor